It's Tuesday night, everybody. That means it's time for Second Look. We're going to take a second look at the message from Sunday. And show of hands, who remembers what Sunday was? It was Resurrection Day. So we're going to revisit the resurrection. And we looked on Sunday at, and we will come back in a little bit, at a passage in John 20 where Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb first. She's the first to see the tomb has been tampered with, and she's the first to see Jesus risen. But we look specifically at a verse in John 20 that talks about the positioning of the angels that she saw in the tomb, one at the head, one at the foot, and a space in between. And we made the connection with that and the mercy seat in the ancient old tabernacle. And then it was transferred to Solomon's temple. And then in the exile, it seems to have disappeared, and when the second temple is built, there is no mercy seat. It's empty. They didn't try and reconstruct it. Where it went, who knows? What happened to it? Did it get melted down? Has it been hidden somewhere? Is it in a crate, in a storage bin somewhere in Washington, D.C., like the movie says? We don't know. Any and all of those are possibilities. But the fixture on top, the mercy seat, is what we kind of looked at just briefly on Sunday. So we want to come back to it. So for everybody here live and in person, we've got a study guide there. And if you're watching online, this is one of the things you miss. But let's take a look in Exodus 25 and just kind of get our bearings about the mercy seat, which, again, my contention is that it was intentional, that in the tomb you have a recreation of the mercy seat. The place where in the temple, once a year, Day of Atonement, lamb's blood was sprinkled on that seat to expunge all the sins of all the people. So very apropos, no? Let's take a look, though. The first appearance of the mercy seat is in Exodus 25. And if you have followed us right along in some of our unseen realm type stuff, you may remember that chapter 24 is a divine council scene that includes humans. A very, very unusual scene. And Yahweh is there, and Moses is there, and the elders are there, the humans, but there are divine beings there. They have a meal together, and the words of God are discussed, and that comes on the heels of the Ten Commandments being given in chapter 20. So 20, 24, significant chapters. Here we are, chapter 25, and it begins to detail what needs to go into the Holy of Holies, the meeting place. I'll leave you to read, along about verse 10. It begins a discussion of the construction of the ark proper, but for our purposes, verse 17, this is the mercy seat now that will sit on top, that I think is referred to in the empty tomb story. You shall make a mercy seat of pure gold, 2.5 cubits long and 0.5 cubits wide. So it's not huge. If you take a cubit to be about 18 inches, so you can kind of get an idea, it's not a huge piece of furniture. You shall make a mercy seat of pure gold, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide. You shall make 2 cherubim of gold. Make them of hammered work at the 2 ends of the mercy seat. So as I said, reading the John 20 passage a while back, as I read it slowly, I began to think, wait a minute, there's an angel at one end and an angel at the other and a blank space in between on the bench. Where have I seen, oh my goodness, where have I seen it before? I've seen it right here with the mercy seat. Make 1 cherub at one end and 1 cherub at the other end. This is one of those cases where the instructions are very explicit and even repetitive. You shall make the cherubim of one piece with the mercy seat at its 2 ends. The cherubim shall have their wings spread upward covering the mercy seat with their wings and facing one another. The faces of the cherubim are to be turned toward the mercy seat. So their positioning as they're sculpted, they are looking down at the mercy seat. Okay? So there it is. There's our first mention. There are many other mentions. Let's talk for a little bit about what we're looking at here, what we're doing here. There's a mention of the cherubim sitting on the mercy seat. Again, in the tomb, you've got these angels, angel, an angel, and a space. Just like cherubim, seraphim, they're the same thing. One is an Egyptian word, and one is a more Middle Eastern word, kind of a Babylonian, Sumerian word. But they mean the same thing, as we will see. They're an order of divine beings, okay? And for you folks that are here, we've been through some of this before, but just by way of refresher, when we see divine beings in the Scripture, we are tempted, and a lot of times the way it's told is, oh, they're all angels. They're all angels. Not so. There are different kinds of divine beings in Scripture. And they go by different terminology. Some of them are described in terms that deal with their nature, what they're like. Some describe their terms of status, how close they are, or their positioning. There seems to be some kind of hierarchy. Again, we're not given hard, fast rules, but some appear closer to the throne than others, for whatever reason, so we call that status terms. And others are identified by terms of function. And that's where our cherubim, seraphim come in. But just by way of refresher, some of the terms that you'll see in Scripture, and this is why we say they're not all angels, divine beings are different kinds of things with different kinds of natures, different functions, and under terms describing nature, some are described as spirits. Spirits. Well, what does that conjure up? Well, the obvious. They are disembodied. They don't have a physical presence, like we do. But they're real, and they're alive, and they have some degree of agency, and they certainly have assignments. But sometimes the Bible describes some of these divine beings as spirits. Sometimes they're called, there's an order of them that seem to be different, that are called heavenly ones. And that idea of spirit is a big, big concept in the Bible. In Hebrew, it's the word ruach. In the New Testament, it's the word pneuma. We get our word pneumatic, pneumonia, having to do with breath from that. But this heavenly ones, let's take a look at just one passage. Psalm 89, verses 5 through 7. Somebody turn to that. And this is a term that describes their nature. So these heavenly ones, we know about them by how their nature is described. So take a look, and there are many, many verses for all of these. But Psalm 89, verses 5 through 7. Who's got it? Anybody got it? Go ahead.
The heavens will praise your wonders, Lord, your faithfulness also in the assembly of the holy ones. For who is in the skies is comparable to the Lord? Who among the sons of the mighty is like the Lord? A God greatly feared in the council of the holy ones, and awesome above all those who are around him.
Okay, so there we've got holy ones, heavenly ones. So that's another kind. There's yet another, described in the Old Testament as stars. Sometimes these divine beings are described as stars. Now, they're not to be confused, and this is where the zodiac gets it all wrong. They're not to be confused with actual stars, Alpha Centauri and all that. But the imagery is used for a couple of different good reasons. Because stars, heavenly bodies, they're up there, right? That's very obvious. They're not here. They're up there. So, theoretically at least, or to the appearance, they are closer to heaven than we are. They're in the heavenlies. So that's one reason why divine beings would be referred to as stars. The other is that stars, actual stars, have movement, don't they? And movement denotes life. If things move, they're living, right? When you're out hunting, you're looking for movement, right? And as soon as you see movement, whoa. Could be your brother-in-law, but I told you to wear orange. But no, movement means life, right? So that's one of the reasons, or a couple of the reasons, that these divine beings would be referred to as stars, okay? Got nothing to do with the zodiac. The zodiac tees off of that incorrectly. They're also known as holy ones. Now this is interesting. Divine beings known as holy ones. In the New Testament, there are a category known as the holy ones, but they aren't divine beings, they're human beings. You're familiar with the word saints. It means literally holy ones. We get words like sanctify and sanctimonious and sanctity. We get from that word saint. It means holy, people who are holy, holy ones. So very interesting, and we're not going to take time to delve into it today, but we are called holy ones just like the divine beings are called holy ones. And there's a whole story behind that, and it's all good. But holy ones is a name that's used for divine beings, different kind of divine beings that describes their nature. Let's look at the last, the D on your sheet there is divine beings. We've been using that terminology. Just by way of review for you folks here, but if you're joining us online and you've never seen this part, this is kind of important. This kind of forms the basis for how we've been looking at Scripture over the last, however long we've been doing this study, 3 years or whatever it's been. It's kind of foundational for us that we understand what this word Elohim means in places like Psalm 82, Psalm 89, many places. The word Elohim is used. Anytime you see an I am word, this is a Hebrew word, obviously. It's the transliteration, the English version of the Hebrew word. Anytime you see an I am, that's plural. And so El is God. That's why you've got a lot of names in the Bible that end with El, Ezekiel, Daniel, so on. It's because the name God is worked into their name. So you've got plural gods. That's the way we typically think of the word Elohim, and it's very often translated in some of our Bibles as gods. That's okay as far as it goes, but the problem is that the whole word of God is for us freighted with a lot of extra meaning that it didn't originally have for the people who first used it. When we use the word God, we mean supreme being. And that's correct, but it's an elastic term that can also mean divine beings. Again, it's plural, all right? It's better to think when we see that word that's often translated gods as what we've been saying, divine beings. Now, that's really key and that's really important. Elohim, divine beings. So the way we say it is, and to keep people's hair from catching on fire and saying, you mean there are a whole bunch of gods? Well, there are a whole bunch of divine beings. And the way we say it is there are many Elohim, because again, the word is plural. There are many Elohim, there are many divine beings. And Yahweh, the one we think of as God, and He is, the supreme being, Yahweh is an Elohim. Yahweh is a divine being. But with this difference, but no other Elohim is Yahweh. That's why Yahweh, and every time you see in the Old Testament L-O-R-D in caps, that is actually the word Yahweh. It's the name Yahweh, the covenant name that was given to Moses. By what name shall I call you? Who is sending me? It's I am. It means I am. The eternally self-existent one. Yahweh is the way the Hebrews would have said it, or something like it. Again, we don't know exactly, and that's why I put this little... If you were to spell Yahweh, what we're saying, Yahweh, and again, that's a guess, and here's why. In English, from the Hebrew, it would be something like YHWH. Well, Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, had no vowel markings. It only had consonants. You just had to memorize. Now, modern Hebrew, there are markings, and if you ever see Hebrew letters, a lot of times there'll be these little apostrophe-looking things that hang off of it. That's the modern markings that help you know what the vowel sounds are. It's also what makes Hebrew a hard language, is just a lot of rote memory. But the way you would spell it in English is YHWH, not pronounceable, right? Over time, because the Hebrew people so revered the name, and it wouldn't be wrong to say they feared the name, and they especially feared desecration of the name, that it was at first politely not pronounced, and then kind of by edict, don't anybody say it. This is what sets everybody on fire when Jesus uses the words, I am, 7 times in John. I am the good shepherd. I am the door. I am the resurrection and the life. He's using the personal name, Yahweh. I am, I am, I am. That's why they pick up rocks to kill him. But eventually it's just, we don't say that name. And because there were no vowel markings, it was no longer in anybody's living memory how to pronounce the name. So what later people did is they took the Hebrew word for Lord, which means master, Adonai, and they just borrowed the vowels out of that and inserted them between these letters where they didn't know what really went. So you end up with an A between that, an O between that, another A between that, and you get something like Yahweh. Or people used to say Jehovah, because Hebrew, like German, the Y's and the J's can sometimes be interchangeable. You heard in German, Jawohl, but it's spelled with a J, Yah. Well, Hebrew's very similar that way. And the same thing with the V's and the W's. In German, V's and W's, they kind of shape-shift. It kind of happens the same way in Hebrew. Actually, we probably should say it the other way around. But anyway, if you insert those in, you can get Yahweh, you can get Yehovah, Jehovah, and that's why you've heard those different variants. All of them are really just guesses. We don't know. There is no certainty. But that's the name. So, back to our Elohim thing. The word Elohim means divine beings. We often translate it gods. But it means divine beings. And so there are many Elohim, that's for sure. We've looked at spirits and heavenly ones and stars. We're going to look at more. There are many Elohim. Yahweh is an Elohim. He is a divine being. But no other Elohim is Yahweh. That's why you see in the Old Testament, he's referred to as God Most High, or the Most High God. In Hebrew, it's El Elyon. Again, that El, God, Most High God, God Most High. He is the highest. That's to differentiate him from all the other divine beings, which, again, is part of our Deuteronomy 32 worldview. The way we're looking at Scripture is at some point there begin to be these rival gods who are bucking for undeserved promotion. And they become the gods of the nations, which Paul will later say they're actually demonic. Those are the demons that people worship. So anyway, a little bit on the nature thing. So there are these different terms for these divine beings that are nature descriptions, but there's some that are terms of status. And I won't go into them all, but in the Old Testament especially, you read about a thing called the assembly. You read about a thing called a council, sometimes a divine council, or a congregation. You read about the court. There are many courtroom scenes. We've looked at a bunch of them. There's a principal one in 1 Kings 22 that we use to kind of suss out how this maybe works, why there are these other divine beings, these Elohim, and why God chooses to use them and how he relies on them for decision making and other things. But anyway, sometimes you see these congregations, you see these courts, you see a reference to princes and principalities. Like in the book of Daniel, you've got the prince of Persia. That is an Elohim. That is a divine being who's over some kind of a geographic area, in this case Persia. Also mention of the prince of Greece over that part. So we'll just leave the status there. But there are some terms for these divine beings in Scripture that don't have anything to do with their nature, they have everything to do with their status. And we even get that carried over into the New Testament where we see things like archangels. They seem to be above, they seem to have more status, and they seem to be closer somehow to the throne. So, all divine beings, but some by nature, some by status. But here's where it gets interesting. Some are terms of function. And these are the more familiar ones. Angel. Again, we tend to think, and it's kind of in our songs and it's in our preaching, that they're all angels. They're not all angels. Angels are a specific kind of divine being. The word angel, Old Testament, is the word malik. If it were English, it would be M-A-L-I-K. It means messenger. Messengers. No, I don't think we'll take time. But there are many scriptures that show these angels are delivering a message. They're not initiating a message, they're delivering a message. Sometimes by words, sometimes by action. But they're on assignment to deliver a message to humans or a group of humans. So you've got angels. That's a term of function. What do? They're messengers. You've also got ones that are called ministers. His ministers are flames of fire. It gets very poetic sometimes. Well, minister, what is that? That's to help. If you minister to somebody, you're helping. An administrator, administration, all those words, they mean to help, to assist. So you've got divine beings that are described by their function, they minister. All right? You've got some are described as watchers. They're watching. For a variety of things, Daniel talks about the watchers. They're watching like guards watching. They're watching like to evaluate. They're watching like to accumulate information. Okay? The watchers. We should just spend a session just on the watchers. Sometimes they're described as the host. In our older Bibles, you see the Lord of hosts. Sometimes they use the Hebrew word Lord Sabaoth. It means the Lord of hosts. Hosts simply means armies. And so some of our newer Bibles will say the Lord of the armies. There are even a few choruses out now that talk about God of angel armies and that kind of thing. So the host, it's armies. Again, their function, they do battle. They do battle in the heavenlies. They protect. We see that in the Old Testament where the prophet is given eyes to see and he sees this mighty host, this mighty army of beings that are encircling and protecting against the ugly enemy. Some of them are referred to as mediators, go-betweens. They get between us and they get between us and God. And they bring them together. There's a theological concept, it's called atonement. And sometimes they're agents of that. They're mediators. Sometimes they're mediators of God's Word. The Bible says, and we looked at this for a long time, a couple weeks, that they were instrumental in delivering what we think of as the law, the 10 Commandments. The book of Acts talks about it a couple times. Paul's letter talks about it a couple times. That the law of God was mediated to us. It was brought to us by these messengers, by these divine beings whose function was to do just that. Now, to our mercy seat. Save them to the last. The cherubim, the seraphim. Let's take a look in Exodus 25:20. We read it, but let's look at it again. Somebody else turned to Exodus 37:9, and someone else to a blockbuster passage, Isaiah 6:1 through 3, and verse 6 as well, same chapter 1. Somebody read out Exodus 25:20. Here's our mercy seat people.
And the cherubim shall have wings spread upward, covering the atoning cover with their wings, facing one another. The faces of the cherubim are to be turned toward the atoning cover.
Whew. Why do you think they're looking at the mercy seat? This is where it all happens. This is where God and humans come together. Right? This is the most important thing from God's perspective and from ours. But from God's perspective, what's he always wanted? He's wanted to be in fellowship, to be surrounded by his family, and our sin has estranged his family from him. He wants the runaways back home. So these beings are laser beamed on what's happening at the mercy seat. God and humans come together the way it should be. You see? Again, shouldn't be lost on us that this happens in the temple, in the tabernacle, which is a picture of what? It's to be a representation of Eden. That's why all the plant imagery and the vines and the pomegranates and the palm trees and all that, the doors that are inlaid olive wood inside of cedar, which are pictures of palm trees inlaid. And then all across the walls on the interior, you've got these carvings and paintings and depictions of different plants and vines and pomegranates and all of that. Well, it's a picture of Eden, you see. It's kind of a formalized Eden. And what was Eden to be? It was to be God's home, where he would be in the middle of it, and he would be surrounded by divine beings. And divine beings were in Eden. That's why Eve was not alarmed when this thing began to talk to her that was non-human. It was divine. It began to talk to her. Of course, it set her on the wrong course, but she wasn't alarmed by it, is the point. And God, surrounded by divine beings and human beings, he wanted that to expand. That's why God said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the whole earth. The original plan was the whole planet would become Eden. The whole planet would become God's home. The whole planet would be filled with his family that he could be surrounded by. And it will be fulfilled, again, Revelation 22. But they're looking at where that happens. The one spot on the planet where it happens. God and humans come together. Take a look in chapter 37 of Exodus, verse 9. These seraphim, cherubim make an appearance again. What's it say? Anybody got it? Eldon, you don't have to ask her permission to read.
The cherubim spread out their wings above, overshadowing the mercy seat with their wings, with their faces one to another toward the mercy seat were the faces of the cherubim.
What a picture, huh? They're captivated by what happens at that spot. They're frozen in time at what happens right there. That's what's going on. Now, take a look in Isaiah, because Isaiah is called by Yahweh to be a prophet. He seems to be a reluctant prophet. And the whole 6th chapter is fascinating. We don't have time. Take a look in Isaiah 6, verses 1 through 3. Who's got it?
In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated on the throne, high and exalted, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphs, each with 6 wings. The 2 covered their face, with two they covered their feet, and with two they were flying, and they were calling one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of His glory.
Wow. Heaven comes down to earth. Where? The temple. The meeting place. Eden. God's house. That's why you get so much family talk in the Old Testament, particularly in the Psalms. Whenever you see a temple reference or the house of God reference, that's family talk. And here God, heaven and earth are coming together. You see mention of both. And they're crying, holy, holy, holy. These seraphim, these divine beings are doing what they do. Take a look at verse 6, same chapter. 6:6. What's it say?
Then one of the seraphs flew to me with live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. But then he touched my mouth and said, See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for.
Yeah, young Isaiah says, I can't do this job. This is what kind of kills me about people today that claim to be prophets. Prophets never wanted the job. How many prophets have we read about that said, no, no, no? Jeremiah says, I'm way too young. Jonah says, I'm not the man for the job. I'm going to Spain. Leave me alone. And yet modern day prophets seem to kind of like the idea. Forgetting that what happened to the prophets, you read about in Hebrews 11, sewn up in animal skins, beat up, smashed, sawn in two. Not a pretty picture. So anytime somebody comes to you and says, hey, you thinking about being a prophet? Not me, man, not me. And that's what these people did too. And that's what Isaiah, he said, I'm a person of unclean, I can't do this. I'm not equipped to do this. I don't have the capacity to do this. And so this divine being, this seraphim, takes a coal and touches his lips. And again, you can read this however you want to read it, but that's a pretty remarkable scene. It's a pretty remarkable scene. Now, let's go back to our John 20. Okay? With all that under our belt, let's go back to our John 20. Mary Magdalene comes in. Well, she's alerted Peter and John, who come out of hiding, run to the tomb, because the tomb is a known quantity. They know where he's been laid. And they go to the site because from Mary Magdalene's report, there's some desecration has taken place. The stone is moved, and we'll look at that in a little bit. The stone is moved, but there's mystery around the whole thing. And she has looked in and knows it's empty. That's all she knows. Well, what can she think except somebody's stolen the body? It's a final humiliation here. So she goes and gets the two apostles who run, as I like to point out, and John tells us 5 times he beat Simon Peter running in the foot race. And so he's in effect, if a guy says it one time, let it slide, but 5 times in a couple verses, he makes sure we know. So he's in effect saying, well, you can think of him as a pope, but he's a slow pope because I beat him. And they leave. It says they go back to their own homes, so they return to the familiar. But verse 11, chapter 20 of John, but Mary Magdalene, was standing outside the tomb weeping. I mean, her heart's broken. So as she wept, she stooped and looked into the tomb. The Greek word there is she peeked. She kind of just peeked in. And it's not empty anymore. She saw 2 angels in white sitting. We don't have time to go back and talk about the robes of the angels, but it means you're in the divine being club. That's why in Revelation 5 it pictures us, believers, wearing white robes. We're wearing the uniform of divine beings, of holy ones. Okay? She sees two angels in white sitting, one at the head and one at the feet, where the body of Jesus had been lying. Mercy seat. So he'd been lying on this mercy seat. So we'll just leave the mercy seat there. That, to me, was just a very kind of a moving thing to think that. And it's one of those things that if you're writing a gospel, what's the likelihood you're going to include details like that and make it up? So it's one of those things that's got the ring of truth about it, because it doesn't do what we would have done and said, see, mercy seat. Get it? Yeah, right. It's just a subtle mention, and then we move on. And that, to me, has the ring of truth to it. Let's take a few minutes, okay, switch gears. So we've got a resurrection. So let's talk about some resurrection evidence. When you think about it, there are three things that commend Jesus' story as being true. You could think of it as his credentials. Number one is the impact of his life on human history. One of the things that commends the idea that Jesus is real and that story is real is the tremendous impact that it's had on human history. And it's had impact on our history through his miracles. I mean, we still marvel at his miracles. We still talk about his miracles. We still, even pagans quote his miracles. Water into wine, and just so many things. But through his miracles and his words. His miracles and his words have had you cannot deny the impact that the miracles and words of Jesus have had on human history. You cannot tell the story of the last 2,000 years without it. The story won't make sense. The elevation of the value of human life and dignity, you don't have it without this story. Case in point, go to a part of the world that hasn't had this story, the Middle East. Human life and dignity are not highly prized there. The Red Cross wasn't invented in Saudi Arabia. The idea of free hospitals and orphanages, not invented in Hindu India. It was invented in places where the influence of his words and miracles took hold, you see. So you can't tell the story of human history for the last 2,000 years without including it in a big way. Is that to say that everything that happened in Western Europe was Christian? Not by a country mile. Because there were plenty of pagans and there were plenty of fakers, as there always are and always will be. But you also can't deny that Christians have built hospitals and orphanages and all kinds of things to help people. And they've done it because they've been motivated by the words and miracles of Jesus. Jesus is a healer. We should be healers. See? The second credential of his is fulfilled prophecies. Depending on how you count these things, but there are 48 major, and I'm talking about major prophecies, Old Testament, that predate him by hundreds of years, that are fulfilled with incredible clarity and detail in the life of Jesus, in the career of Jesus. That he would be born of the tribe of Judah. You see, you can't arrange these things. What family you're born in, right? We had no agency over that. Like we used to tell kids in preschool, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit. But there, among the major things are things like he was born, it said he would be born of the tribe of Judah, and guess what? He's born of the tribe of Judah, which is a fact that nobody ever seems to challenge. The word says he will have a miraculous entry into life, a virgin birth. What is more miraculous and unexplainable and unusual than a virgin birth? I can't think of anything. I didn't see that one coming. But it says it in the Old Testament, and then so it happens. So you've got these big things like it says he will be like Moses. And what do you get in the book of Matthew? You get this new Moses with a new law on a new mountain. He even feeds the people miraculously. It's Moses, 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 like unto Moses, you see. And that was a prophecy. It says that he will be betrayed by a friend, and so he was. The prophecy even says how much, the amount. And that's exactly what happened. It says that in his death, none of his bones, he'll be mangled, but none of his bones will be broken. Psalm 22. It details the swelling of the tongue and the outstretched arms and the piercing and all the rest. I mean, he got beat up, but no bones broken. That was the prophecy. What happens on the cross? Let's speed this thing along. And they come along with a sledge and they break the miscreant's legs so that they can't hold themselves up. They'll collapse. They'll suffocate. But when they come to Jesus, he's already dead. And so the Roman soldier, to make sure he's not putting on, stabs him. Yeah, stabs him. And out comes blood and water, which indicates that cardiac sac around the heart, it was full of fluid. Broken heart. Broken heart. So anyway, all these prophetic words, that he was very poor, he would have nothing, but he would be buried with the rich. And so it happened, you see. So there are major ones, at least 48, depending on how you count. But in reality, there's over 350 prophecies fulfilled by Jesus. And that's one of his credentials. When you witness to Jewish people that know their Old Testament, this is the way you do it. But there's a third thing, and that's his resurrection. The reality of the resurrection. Now, there's plenty in the Bible about his resurrection, but let me just read you a paragraph that comes from our old friend Josephus, whom we've talked about before. He's a Jewish historian, 1st century, and we spent some time a while back talking about his pedigree. He's fairly reliable. When we can check him out with other sources, he almost always lines up. And sometimes he's on the cutting edge. But here's a paragraph. It comes from his one book. He has two, one called The Jewish Wars, one called Antiquities of the Jews. Here's from the Antiquities. He says, now there was about this time, he talks about Jesus. There was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him man, for he was a doer of wonderful works. This guy is a contemporary now. He was not a always great person. In fact, Jewish people, he's a traitor. They spit when they say his name because he was a turncoat. He escaped Jerusalem as it was falling, and he sides with the Romans. But here's what he records. He was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him many Jews and also many of the Greeks. This man was the Christ, Messiah. And when Pilate had condemned him to the cross, so there he mentions Pilate, he anchors it in history. Pilate was the proconsul, the governor of that part of those imperial lands. That's what a proconsul was over. He was like the emperor extended in that particular area. and he served for a specific amount of time, and he anchors it in Pilate's time. When Pilate condemned him to the cross upon his impeachment by the principal man among us, those who had loved him from the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive on the third day, the divine prophets having spoken these and thousands of other wonderful things about him. And even now, the race of Christians, so named from him, Christian, Christ, has not died out. So there's testimony from a secular source, a non-biblical source, that references the resurrection. Now, whether Josephus believed it or not is not the point. For our purposes, here's something outside the Bible that mentions the resurrection of Christ. Okay, so that's some kind of evidence. Let's take a look at the stone. In Mark 16, let's take a look there. Last chapter of Mark, it mentions the stone. Somebody read 3 through 4 for us, Mark 16. Who's got it?
They were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb for us?"
The problem is the thing is so stinking heavy. It weighs a couple tons, maybe more. And there is mention in the Gospels about they're especially troubled by the possibility that somebody could take the body away and say it's a resurrection, or it's miraculous, or he ascended, or he was assumed into heaven, or whatever they might say. They entertain the possibility as they're burying him. You know, we got to guard against this. So it's very possible that they put an extra heavy stone there that would have taken more than 2 or 3 or 4 or even 5 men to move. So the ladies that are going to the tomb on that day, and they're not able to go the day before because it's Sabbath. So now it's another day, and they couldn't go when the day began. Jewish days began at 6 p.m., so think 6 p.m. on Saturday would have been a new day, but it's dark, and there's no lights, and it's a graveyard, and it's not safe, and so we don't do that. So they wait until it's almost sunup. Makes all kind of sense, right? Again, the details in the story really ring true. But as they're headed that direction, their discussion is, okay, this is a great plan, but how are we going to get in there? Who is going to roll that stone away for us? So it tells us that it was a very large stone. In fact, almost every time the Gospels mention the stone, it talks about its size, its immensity, its weight, and its almost immovability because it is so big. So there's the problem of the stone. Take a look in Matthew 28:2. Somebody else look at Luke 24:2. Part of the evidence is the positioning of that stone relative to its immensity. What's Matthew 28:2 say?
And behold, a severe earthquake had occurred, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled away the stone and sat upon it.
So it was a supernatural act. And I don't know if the angel was just being cheeky or not, but he sits on it. He rolled it away and sits on it. Take a look at one more. Luke 24:2. Luke, Mr. Careful Historian, what's he record?
They found the stone rolled away from the tomb.
The construction of that sentence, and we won't get in the weeds, indicates that it was not just, it would have had like a trench or a cradle or something that, an incline that you could have pushed it up or pushed it down to get it out of the way and expose the opening. But that's not the construction of the sentence. It's some distance away, and a term that's used, ekbalo, it seems to have been thrown. So when this supernatural earthquake via the angel comes to move the stone, it's not just barely getting it out of the way so you can squeeze in again. No, it's... So the stone tells you something. There's a piece of evidence there. The positioning of that stone, that was not done by humans, which is what the text says. It wasn't done by humans. Take a look at the seal. Matthew 27, verse 66. Matthew 27 is one of those long chapters. When it comes in our Bible reading calendar, you know you're going to sit down for a minute and read that one.
So they went out and secured the tomb, sealing the stone and posting guards.
They sealed the stone. Now the backstory is that, again, the critics, the people who had him killed, said, they're going to try and move that stone, take the body. They're thinking of every scenario and somehow proclaim it supernatural. So we've got to guard against that, and one of the ways we can legally guard against that is by sealing it. What that involved was some kind of a cord or a piece of cloth or something, and here's this big stone, however big it is, but it's big, and the cord is longer than the stone is big, and on one side of the cliff, of the cave face, you seal it with a big blob of wax. And on the other side, you seal it with a big blob of wax so that the only way you can get in is break that seal. And the seals would have been the imperial seal, the governor's seal, the proconsul's seal. Would have been it's a Roman thing. Romans were famous for sealing documents that way so that the wrong people wouldn't open the document. We see that in the book of Revelation with the 7 seals on the scroll. Blobs of wax with some kind of an imprint. And you would know if somebody read your mail. You would know if somebody got in this tomb. Because the seal would be broken. Now, the penalties for breaking a seal like that, that's an imperial thing. That's a Roman thing. Crucifixion. No questions asked. You break that, you die. You die an agonizing death. Which meant that there weren't a lot of people going around breaking seals. You're just not going to do it. It ain't worth it. It ain't worth it. And that was the point. So the thing was sealed with this imperial seal that would have scared the wits out of anybody who even thought remotely, I think I'll get in there and take the body and monkey around there, whether they were friend or foe. And so there you've got the evidence of the Roman seal. Seals were not broken. You didn't do that. Then you've got the Roman guard. We're running out of time, so you can look it up on your own. The Roman guard, if they messed up on duty, gone. The Roman army was so effective during this period. Now later on, the Roman army was not made up of Romans. It was not made up of Italians, which at this point it was. That's why you see when Peter meets Cornelius, the Roman centurion, it says specifically he's Italian. During the high point of the empire and the republic, the army was made up of Romans. It was a citizens' army, which were much more effective. Later on in the empire, the army was made up of non-citizens, people from outlying regions who were given a promise of citizenship. If you served for 16 years, sometimes 20 years, you got your citizenship, and you would get a tract of land or a sum of money. And so people were serving for those reasons, but they weren't Romans. They didn't have the Roman heart. They didn't have the Roman interest. They weren't protecting the motherland. They weren't protecting Rome. They were working. It was a job. And that's one of the reasons that the empire decayed. But anyway, at this point, you've got these people that are committed to what they're doing. And the Roman army was so effective because Roman discipline was so swift. And the solution for everything was you died. If you're a bad soldier, you died. So if you go to sleep on the job, you die. You didn't go to sleep on the job. You just didn't. You would do everything you could. You did not go to sleep on the job. And so the charge that is later made by the critics is, oh, the Roman soldiers fell asleep. That's unthinkable. If that story had gotten out with any credibility, you know whose head would be on the chopping block? Pilate's. Because he is the head of the army in that region as well as the political head. So, no. 100 times no. It didn't happen. It didn't happen that way. So you've got the Roman guard, which, by the way, they never could have dreamed, but they will become witnesses. Because when it happens, the earthquake, the angel, all of that, it says that they fall down stone dead. They're not dead, but it's like they're immobile. They're terrified. You didn't terrify a Roman soldier. They just didn't get terrified. Their training and so on and what they had seen and where they'd been, these were not people that you easily frightened. So there's that. You've got to explain that. But part of the most convincing, and we'll just stop here for tonight, is the grave clothes. Somebody has said the grave clothes tell a tale, and they do. Because, and I'll leave you to look it up later on, in John 20, verses 3 through 9, Peter and John run to the thing. John looks in, and he sees something that startles him. Peter, being who he is, he goes in. He pushes past John. He goes in, and it says, with what he sees, he believes. Now, he doesn't completely understand, because it does say, next verse, he didn't understand what he was seeing. He couldn't process it. But what did he see? He saw the grave clothes, and it specifically describes how he saw the grave clothes, that he saw the wrapping for the head. It was off by itself, folded up. Some of our old Bibles call it the napkin. It was what was covering his head. Think mummy. And it was folded up in a different location from what he saw of the grave clothes that had covered the body. And the indicator is that that's what made him believe. It wasn't the wrapped up. You would have expected if he had revived and unwound himself, or somebody had unwound him, you could imagine the picture of these wrappings. That's sort of what you've got with the head covering, but not with the rest of it. It's in the shape of a body, but it's collapsed because there's no body in it anymore. In other words, he didn't get up, unwind, somebody didn't unwind him. He shot through it. He went through it. And the positioning of those clothes and Peter's and John's reaction to it tells a story. That's the story it tells, is they believed because they saw the grave clothes like a cocoon that had been exited without it bursting or tearing or being damaged in any way. So no wonder they couldn't understand it. But they had to acknowledge something supernatural happened here to his body. So anyway, we'll leave it there. That's some resurrection evidence. If you want, next week we'll pick up for a minute and come back to number 6, 7, and 8. Because on the day of Pentecost, there is mention of this resurrection by Simon Peter, and nobody in the crowd, and we know this crowd doesn't have a problem being a heckler, because they accused the Spirit-filled disciples of being drunk at 9 a.m., and then they heckle a little bit more. What does all this mean? So it's not like it's a bashful crowd, and 2 times Simon Peter hits him between the eyes like a board with the reality of the resurrection. He mentions the bodily resurrection of Christ, and there is complete silence on their part. That tells you something. In Acts chapter 17, when Paul stands before the Acropolis, before the crowd there, and he is like a new Socrates, and he's talking about this unknown God that they don't know anything about. I'll tell you all about the God you don't know anything about. And he begins to do that, and he talks about Christ, and then he mentions the resurrection, and it says they laugh. Well, why did they laugh and the people in Jerusalem didn't laugh? Because the people in Jerusalem knew the tomb was empty. If they hadn't known the tomb was empty, somebody in that hostile crowd would have said, "Shut up, let's walk down to the tomb." But the whole city knows it's empty. And what do we do with that? So they know what the Athens crowd doesn't know. I understand why the Athens crowd laughed. But I also understand why the Jerusalem crowd didn't, you see? So anyway, we'll leave it there. And thank you to everybody who joined us online and stuck with us. God bless you.